This show has spent almost 2 decades showing us how evil these men are. Ralph gets called a psychopath. Phil gets reduced to pure vengeance with a pulse. Many people have ranked Livia the third greatest villain in television history, ahead of people on this exact list who actually pulled triggers. I'm not adding another video to that pile. I'm going the other way. For every name coming up, I went looking for something real, proof that somewhere in there, a person capable of something decent was still in the room, whatever that ended up costing him later. Not gonna lie, for a few of these people, I had a hard time to find something good. But I like to think there's always something. Let's start with the one you were probably thinking about when you saw the title, Ralph. I had to dig harder for something good in Ralph than for anyone else on this list, and if you know this show, you already know why. This is a man who stands over Vito's brother in a hospital bed, a man doctors feared might never fully recover after being beaten into a coma, and offers him, in Ralph's own words, a bright side.
Wasn't that smart to begin with?
Soon after, he beats a young woman to death in a parking lot after she tells him she's pregnant. But there's something there, and it surfaces at almost the exact moment the show starts getting ready to kill him. Ralph's son Justin is hit by an arrow one afternoon, fired into the air by a friend during a backyard game, and it strikes him in the chest. He goes without air reaching his lungs for several minutes, long enough to risk permanent damage to his brain. Nobody plans it, and nobody in the show ever fully explains it. It just happens, and Justin ends up in critical condition while Ralph sits at his bedside completely undone. The writers have said outright that they built this stretch of the season specifically to give Ralph a moment of real humanity before killing him off, and it shows. He goes to Father Phil looking for something like forgiveness. Strange for a man who treats most things, including religion, as a punchline. Sets up a scholarship at Rutgers worth $20,000 a year in the name of Jackie, Rosalie's son, and finds Rosalie herself to actually apologize, telling her he wasn't there for her the way he should have been after she lost that son, before asking her to marry him. She turns him down. She accepts the apology anyway, which tells you the apology landed even if the marriage never had a chance. I think what's actually happening in this stretch isn't that Ralph becomes a different person, it's that the fear of losing his own son opens a door in him that's apparently been there the whole time. He suddenly understands, in his body, what it costs to almost lose a child, and everything he does afterward is him trying to become someone who deserves to keep his. None of it erases what came before it, and the show doesn't let it. Around the same time Justin is fighting for his life, Tony's racehorse dies in a stable fire that insurance investigators call an accident, and Tony never does. Ralph and Tony split a $200,000 policy on that horse. Justin's hospital bills are piling up fast, and Ralph denies setting the fire right up until the moment Tony kills him over it. The same man capable of sitting at his son's bedside and grieving like any other father may also be the man who burned an animal alive to pay for that son's recovery. If that's true, the tenderness and the arson came from the exact same place, a father who would do anything, including something monstrous, for his kid. Ralph creates it and is dead within the same stretch of episodes, killed by Tony over the horse, never around long enough to find out what, if anything, it actually became. Next psychopath is Richie. Richie is one of the harder cases on this list, and I want to be upfront that some of you might even say it's bullshit, but I genuinely tried my best to find something for this guy. The good here comes tangled up with something else almost every time. He does step in for Adriana. Richie can't stand watching Christopher hit his niece, and he tells him directly to stop, warns him it won't happen again on his watch. That's a real protective instinct, the kind that doesn't have to exist in this world at all. It comes with an ugly asterisk, though. His protection only holds while Christopher and Adriana are unmarried, which tells you Richie's whole sense of right and wrong runs on family property lines more than anything resembling actual principle. There's also the jacket, the one he gives Tony as a gesture of respect, the story attached to it clearly meaning something to him. Except the jacket has a history. A man he assaulted years earlier, a beating brutal enough to end that man's reputation for good. Handing Tony a trophy from that reads less like generosity and more like currency. One violent man showing another violent man what he's capable of, and calling it a gift. I think the most honest thing I can say about Richie is that whatever capacity for real feeling he has gets swallowed almost entirely by how badly he needs to be respected. That need is what's actually driving him when he threatens Matt for shooting Christopher without permission, more fury that somebody moved on his territory without asking than loyalty to Christopher specifically, and it's what's underneath the very last thing that happens to him. Richie has a son, little Ricky, a dancer who wants nothing to do with any of this, and the fight that finally gets him killed by his own fiancée is about that son's sexuality, not about protecting him. Every other father on this list gets at least one scene of real tenderness toward his kid. Richie's version of that scene is a man so unable to accept who his son actually is that it becomes the last conversation he ever has. Moving on to Phil. Phil is also one of the hardest to find something good. But there is something real here, even if it's smaller than what the others get. His grief over his younger brother Billy is completely genuine. Billy gets killed during the Lupertasi power struggle, and Phil's devastation in that moment isn't performed for anyone watching. It's raw, immediate, the kind of grief that doesn't know how to be anything except itself yet. I think that's actually the most human Phil ever looks in the entire show, before he decides what to do with it. What he decides to do with it is turn it into a war that ends up killing far more people than the ones actually responsible for Billy, Bobby, and Silvio among them, neither of whom had anything to do with what happened to his brother. That's not a footnote to the grief. It's what the grief becomes once it passes through him, which tells you something about the distance between feeling something real and doing something good with it. In case you haven't heard him reminding you every 5 minutes, he survives 20 years in prison too, which takes a kind of endurance most people never have to test in themselves, and I think that's worth acknowledging as its own thing before it curdles. Instead of coming out of it with any perspective, though, Phil comes out entitled, certain that 2 decades inside has earned him the right to take whatever he wants, as if the sacrifice itself is a debt the rest of the world now owes him. After a heart attack nearly kills him, Phil talks about wanting to slow down and actually enjoy his grandchildren, and I don't think he's lying in that moment. He also keeps escalating the war anyway, right up until it gets him killed in a gas station parking lot with his wife and grandchildren in the car a few feet away. Whatever tenderness was actually in him, for Billy, for his grandkids, never once slowed him down when it mattered. Christopher. Christopher wants to be an artist his entire life, long before Cleaver ever gets made, and the mob keeps treating that ambition like a joke he'll eventually grow out of. He writes anyway, keeps trying anyway, and eventually actually finishes something real instead of leaving it as another thing he talked about at the Bing and never did. He does something similar for Adriana, and I think it's easy to miss because of everything else that's true about their relationship. When she wants to record a demo, he doesn't dismiss it the way plenty of men in his position would. He backs it, and later gives her an actual nightclub to run, a real business with her name on it. Whatever else is true about how he treats her, and there's a great deal that isn't defensible, he takes her ambitions seriously in a world that mostly doesn't take women's ambitions seriously at all. He also tries, repeatedly, to get sober, and it costs him more than people around him seem to understand. Staying clean pulls him out of the social center of the entire crew, since drinking is basically the currency of every relationship in that world, and Tony and the others mock him for it, needle him back toward the bar, treat his sobriety like a personality flaw instead of the genuinely difficult thing it is. He relapses more than once. He also keeps going back to meetings anyway, which I think is more effort than this show usually gives its characters credit for. When Adriana dies, whatever love Christopher had for her, twisted and abusive as so much of it was, turns out to be real enough to destroy him. He relapses hard, breaks down in ways he never lets anyone see otherwise, and never really recovers the ground he'd built with his sobriety before her death. Paulie finds out in his 60s that the woman who raised him, the aunt he's called Ma his entire life, isn't actually his mother, and that his real mother gave him up to her sister to raise. He reacts about as badly as you'd expect from a man who's spent decades performing toughness over anything resembling real feeling. He pulls back from Nucci completely, furious and humiliated, and stays away. Then he comes back anyway. No speech, no big reconciliation scene, no apology demanded from either side. He just shows up at Green Grove one day and sits next to her in front of the television, the same way he always used to.
You want some cookies?
And that's the whole reconciliation. I think it might be the quietest thing Paulie does in the entire series, and probably the most honest, because there's nobody around for him to perform it for. That same capacity shows up again after Christopher dies. Paulie doesn't perform grief the way some of the others do. He just says, plainly, that all their years of fighting over money and respect never meant anything, and that he should have been better to Christopher while he had the chance. It's about as close to genuine self-reflection as this man ever allows himself on screen, and it comes without anyone asking him for it. He's also, in his own strange accounting, been supporting his church for 23 years, paying toward organ repairs and new robes for the altar boys, and the second he starts talking about it, the generosity curdles into something transactional and petty, a ledger of what God owes him back. But the money was real before he started keeping score on it, and I think that's true of most of what's underneath Paulie generally. He's a genuinely funny, sociable man once you get past the paranoia and the vanity, someone who forms real attachments and then spends most of his energy hiding them behind jokes, grudges, and a hairstyle he's more protective of than most of his relationships. Silvio, ask anyone who spent real time with this show who they'd actually want in their corner if something went wrong, and a lot of people land on Silvio before they land on Tony. That says something, since Silvio isn't the boss, isn't the one with the money or the final word. What he has instead is a kind of steadiness nobody else in this circle can fake, the sense that whatever he tells you is what he actually believes, not what's useful for him to say in the moment. You can watch that steadiness do real work in small, quiet places. When Tony gets shot by his own uncle and spends days unconscious, most of the men around him spend that time worrying about their own position. Silvio sits at the hospital and rests his hand on Tony's arm with nobody there to see it, which is really the whole point, since a gesture only means something when there's no audience for it. He runs the family competently while Tony's out and hands it back the moment Tony's ready. No power grab, no hesitation. When Tony admits he's been seeing a psychiatrist, at a time when that confession could get a man quietly pushed out of this world for looking weak, Silvio just accepts it and keeps trusting him exactly the same as before. He's just as steady at home, if not more. He calls his daughter Heather his principessa, and it isn't a bit he does for other people, it's just how he actually talks about her. When her soccer coach turns out to be preying on one of her teammates, something in Silvio goes somewhere very few things do, and he wants the man dead, immediately, with his own hands if it comes to that. Tony is preparing to have the man killed too, but Artie eventually pushes Tony to let it go through the authorities, and Silvio, a man whose entire professional identity runs on not backing down, accepts the decision. That's worth sitting with for a second. The same instinct that makes him dangerous, the willingness to meet a threat to someone he loves with total force, is also the thing he's capable of putting down the moment it stops being about protecting her and starts being about his own need for revenge. That's what makes what happens with Adriana so hard to reconcile. When Tony needs someone to get her out of the way after she's been informing to the FBI, he doesn't pick someone reckless. He picks the one person she'd have no reason to doubt, precisely because Silvio has never given her any. Silvio lies to her, drives her into the woods, and kills her there while she's trying to get away. There's no version of this that softens what he does, but it tells you something, that the very quality that makes Silvio worth trusting with everything, his steadiness, his refusal to panic, his loyalty to whoever's giving the order, is exactly what makes him capable of doing something monstrous without his hands shaking. The same part of him that touches Tony's arm in a hospital room is the part that drives Adriana into the woods, just aimed somewhere else that day. By the end of the series, Silvio's the one in the coma, shot outside his own club, and it's Tony who sits with him and holds his hand the way Silvio once held his. Whatever the show means by giving these two men that exact mirrored gesture twice, at minimum, it's saying the loyalty between them was real, on both sides, right up to the end. Livia. Livia is the one person on this list where I have to be honest with you that the search is genuinely difficult, and I don't want to manufacture more than what's actually there. But I also don't think nothing is the right answer, so let me tell you what I actually found. There's a real moment of warmth. When Meadow gets into college, Livia reacts with something that actually looks like pride and gives her money as a reward. No manipulation attached that the show ever reveals. For one scene, she's just a grandmother, happy for her granddaughter, and I think that's worth taking at face value rather than looking for the trick in it. After Livia dies, the family discovers she kept boxes of Tony's childhood belongings, carefully saved for decades. I want to believe that's love, and maybe it partly is. But she kept almost nothing of her daughter Barbara's, and nothing at all of Janice's, and I think that tells you Livia was capable of attachment, just not the kind that spreads evenly. Whatever she felt for Tony specifically was real enough to survive her own death in a box in a closet. It just came at the cost of her other two children, who got nothing saved for them at all. I think the more useful question with Livia isn't whether she was capable of love. It's why it only ever seemed to reach one child, and what that says about a woman who grew up poor, watched her husband cheat and terrify her for decades, and seems to have decided somewhere along the way that Tony, at least, was hers to keep. That's not an excuse for what she does with her power later, encouraging her own son's murder among it. But it might be the closest thing to an explanation the show ever gives her. Junior. By the time dementia has taken almost everything else from Junior, including the memory that he ran an entire criminal organization for years, one thing survives. He remembers playing catch with a young Tony, back before either of them became what they became, and it's the detail Tony chooses to hold on to in their final scene together, long after Junior can't place who Tony even is anymore. I think that detail is doing more work than it looks like. Of everything a man could lose his mind and still keep, Junior keeps the version of himself that existed before ambition and resentment took over. It's a strange thing to feel moved by, given that Junior is also the reason Tony ends up in a coma, shooting his own nephew because his failing mind mistakes him for an old rival from decades earlier. But the show doesn't let that moment erase what came before it. Years earlier, when Richie is quietly building a coup against Tony, Jr. is the one who tips Tony off instead of joining it. Self-interest plays a part, sure, he's no saint about it. But some older loyalty to his brother's son still wins out over the temptation of Richie's offer. And it's information that likely keeps Tony alive. He has a real connection to the family's older traditions, too, the kind nobody else in his generation seems to carry anymore. At Jackie Jr.'s funeral, Jr. sings, and for one of the only times in the entire show, a room full of men who perform toughness for a living just stops and cries along with him. No jokes, no posturing, nothing to prove. None of this erases what Jr. did with his power while he still had it. But dementia ends up doing something the show never manages any other way. It erases the schemes, the resentment, decades of feeling like the family always chose Tony's father over him. And what's left standing afterward is just an old man who loved a little boy playing catch in a backyard, long before either of them had any idea what they'd become to each other. Johnny Sack is the one who actually seems to have the marriage everyone else around him is faking. He's faithful to his wife Ginny in a world where infidelity is basically a job requirement, and he never once treats her weight as a mark against her. When Ralph makes a cruel joke about her body at a party, Johnny doesn't laugh it off the way a more careful man might. He wants Ralph dead for it, immediately, and it takes real effort from the people around him to talk him back. I think that single detail tells you more about him than almost anything else the show gives us. His rage there isn't about his own ego getting bruised in front of other men, the usual currency in this world. It's specifically about somebody hurting the person he loves, and the fact that his first instinct is murder doesn't make the underlying feeling less real. It just tells you how far he's willing to go for her, further than any of his rivals would go for anyone. Early on, before New York turns into a war he can't walk back from, Johnny is the steady one, the guy who gets a furious call from a capo on one side and an insulted boss on the other and actually talks them down instead of letting it escalate. He cancels the hit on Ralph himself once the immediate rage passes, which tells you the anger was real but never fully in control of him. He's the reason a dozen smaller conflicts in this show never turn into funerals, a kind of quiet competence nobody ever really thanks him for. None of that steadiness survives prison, but even locked up, what actually breaks him isn't losing power. It's his daughter Allegra's wedding, a single day he's allowed out in cuffs and under guard to attend, and watching federal agents pull him away from his own family in front of every guest strips away the suits and the threats completely. What's left is just a husband and father who built an entire criminal career around protecting the two things he actually valued, and lost both of them anyway. Pussy spends his final months on the show betraying the only family he's ever really had, wearing a wire for the FBI to save himself from a heroin charge. What I find strange, and genuinely moving, is that the person he's most tender with during all of it is a teenager who has no idea any of this is happening. At AJ's confirmation, Pussy pulls him aside and actually tries to parent him for a minute, telling him to appreciate his health, his family, and the people who love him while he still has them. It's simple advice, the kind any decent uncle might give, and I think that's exactly why it lands. Pussy isn't performing wisdom for anyone watching. He's telling a kid the truth he wishes someone had told him before he ended up here. He brings up how Tony visited his own dying sister in the hospital repeatedly when there was nothing in it for him, and holds it up to AJ as what real friendship actually looks like. He's not just teaching AJ a lesson. He's reminding himself, out loud, of the version of loyalty he's about to betray. The guilt isn't hidden or subtle either. After one of these moments with AJ, Pussy breaks down alone, undone by what he's doing to people who still think he's theirs. It would be easy to read The Wire as proof he never really loved these people, but I don't think that's right. He's wearing it because the FBI has him cornered on a charge that could put him away for good, and loving Tony and Silvio and Paulie was never going to be enough to make that fear go away. Both things are true in him at once, the love and the betrayal, right up until the end. Tony finds out, and the men who kill Pussy on that boat are the same men he'd spent years drinking and joking with, the exact people the AJ speech was supposedly about. He meant every word of what he told that kid. He also spent those same months lying to everyone in his life who mattered. Janice. Janice spends most of this show being awful to almost everyone around her, so it's worth actually noticing the one stretch where she tries to become a different person, because I think the attempt is genuinely real. She goes through anger management seriously, not as a performance for Tony or anyone else, and for a while it visibly works. She's calmer, easier to be around, less like the woman who spent years manipulating everyone in her path. Tony can't stand it. Watching his sister actually improve, after years of his own therapy barely moving the needle on his own worst instincts, seems to be more than he can tolerate, and he needles her about something he knows will set her off until it finally does. I don't think the explosion that follows erases the progress that came before it. If anything, it proves how easily someone can be talked back into the version of themselves that's more convenient for everyone around her, which says as much about Tony's need to keep her exactly where she was as it does about Janice. She's also the one who goes to Tony when Junior runs out of money for his care and needs a better facility, and asks Tony to help pay for it. Tony says no. Whatever Janice's usual motives are, wanting an old man who terrorized her childhood to at least be looked after isn't the worst instinct available to her, and she's the only one in the family who actually raises it. After Bobby dies, Janice wants to keep raising his children alongside her own daughter rather than see the family split apart. Her history with children generally deserves real skepticism, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. But grief seems to hit her honestly both times it counts. When Tony gets shot, and again when Bobby dies, and a woman who spends this much of the show performing feelings for effect doesn't fake those particular moments. Mikey, not everyone on this list gets a redemption, and I think pretending otherwise would undercut everyone else here who actually earned one. Mikey, Mustang Sally, and Coco all belong in the conversation about evil on this show, and for all three of them, I genuinely looked and came up close to empty. These guys actually suck. Mikey's most defining trait is loyalty to Junior, showing up, driving him around, absorbing whatever risk Junior needs absorbed without complaint. It's real, in the narrow sense that it never wavers. It's also loyalty to one of the more petty, resentful men in the entire show, in service of nothing bigger than Junior's own bruised ego. Mustang Sally spends his brief time on screen as an unstable, violent criminal, most notably beating Brian Spatafor with a golf club. Coco, similarly, never gets a single scene that asks the audience to see him as anything other than a threat, and eventually gets left badly injured by Tony. I don't think that absence is a failure of research. The show is being honest about something here. Not every person in this world gets a redemptive flicker, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. Some men just are what they do. Tony, everyone on this list gets one, maybe two genuine moments of decency to work with. Tony gets more than anyone, partly because the show simply gives him more time than the rest of this list combined. But I think it's also because he's just more capable of real feeling than almost anyone he commands, and watching what he does with that capacity is the whole reason a video like this is worth making. When AJ tries to drown himself in the family pool, Tony doesn't hesitate for a second. He jumps in fully dressed, pulls the cinder block off his son, and holds him while he sobs, calling him baby, completely unguarded in a way he almost never lets himself be anywhere else in the show. During Meadows' college trip, he finally tells her the truth about where the money comes from, and she tells him about the meth she's been using to study, and for one of the only times in the series, honesty between two Sopranos actually brings relief instead of consequences. His love for animals bypasses every defense he uses on people, which I've always found genuinely moving rather than just interesting. When Pyomai dies, his grief is instant and physical in a way his grief for actual murdered human beings almost never is. He visits Pussy's dying sister in the hospital, repeatedly, for no reason except that it's the decent thing to do. Even when he's finally forced into violence against someone close to him, it isn't always without conscience. Given the choice between letting Phil torture a cousin slowly, or ending it himself, fast, he chooses the second, which is a strange thing to be able to call mercy and still mean it. I think what makes Tony the hardest person on this list to write about is that he never gets to plead limitation the way almost everyone else here does. Ralph gets one redemptive stretch before he dies. Silvio's decency lives mostly in gesture and restraint. Tony has the full range. Tenderness, honesty, grief, mercy, all of it proven real again and again. And he still walks out of his son's near drowning and back into a life of extortion and violence without any visible struggle to hold both at once. I don't fully understand how a person does that, and I'm not sure the show fully understands it either. It just keeps showing us that he can. That's really what this whole list adds up to, I think. Every name on it, Ralph crying over a scholarship and a dead boy's name, Silvio holding a friend's hand at one bedside, Livia saving a box of her son's toys, Tony most of all, had a real capacity for the kind of decency that makes someone worth loving. None of them were incapable of it. If anything, it makes these people harder to simplify. I don't think it makes them easier to forgive. Maybe that's the most honest thing this show ever argues, that the worst people you'll ever meet are rarely missing a piece. They're just choosing over and over not to use the piece they have.